Imagine living trapped by invisible forces, isolated from everyone you love, lost in suffering that seems endless. This was the reality of the Gadarene man, a man dominated by a legion of demons, dwelling among tombs, crying out for help no one could give. Perhaps you've felt this way too, bound by something that steals your peace, drains your joy, and feels impossible to overcome. But here's the hope: where no one saw a way out, Jesus saw an opportunity. He crossed the sea, faced the darkness, and with a single word, completely transformed this man's life. If you've ever felt like you're fighting something bigger than yourself, this story is for you. Today, you'll discover that no force, no matter how great, is beyond Jesus' power to conquer. Get ready to connect with a story of liberation, power, and hope, because the same Jesus who set the Gadarene free is ready to move in your life too. Jesus and his disciples had crossed the Sea of Galilee, a journey that had already been marked by significance, as a fierce storm had threatened to capsize their boat along the way. But with a single word of authority, Jesus calmed the raging waters, revealing his power over creation to his disciples. Finally, they arrived on the other side, in the territory of the Gadarenes, a land outside the traditional Jewish areas, known to be inhabited by people who did not share the same customs and faith. The arrival of Jesus brought an immediate spiritual shift that seemed to resonate throughout the region. It was as though an invisible wave of light had traveled through the territory, disturbing an ancient darkness that resided there. Gadara was known for its hills and, especially, for the area where tombs were located. In this place, avoided by most, lived a man who everyone feared and shunned. Known as the Gadarene Demoniac, many believed his presence brought a curse. He lived among the tombs, cut off from human society, under a spiritual oppression so intense that it had stripped him of any trace of peace and dignity. The impact of Jesus' arrival was immediate. Even before he saw him, something within the man tormented by demons reacted. He seemed to sense the approach of a different presence, a light that disturbed the legion of unclean spirits that imprisoned him. As Jesus walked, something supernatural began to happen. The strength and authority of his presence were so powerful that the demons, feeling the power of the Son of God, began to stir within the man. It was as if they knew their defeat was imminent. The possessed man, covered in scars and torn clothes, started running toward Jesus. Screaming, he crossed the field that separated the tombs from the shore where Jesus stood. The disciples, witnessing the scene with wide eyes of shock and fear, stayed behind Jesus, realizing something extraordinary was about to happen. Many feared this man, for no one could control him. He would break every chain and restraint with supernatural strength. But Jesus remained calm, watching the man's approach with compassion and authority. When he reached Jesus, the demoniac fell to his knees. He could not control the words that came out of his mouth, for the demons within him spoke, revealing the terror they felt in Christ's presence. "What have we to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" the demons shouted. "Have you come here to torment us before the appointed time?" The man's voice was distorted, reflecting the intense spiritual battle happening within him. There, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, stood Jesus, the light who had come to break the chains of darkness. His mere presence had provoked a reaction that the people of Gadara never imagined possible. It was the very Son of God, bringing redemption and deliverance to a man who had become a symbol of despair and loss for his community. At that moment, everyone who was there, even those watching from a distance, began to sense something special and mysterious in Jesus' presence. It was as though a greater and more powerful force than anything they had known was there, ready to confront any evil. Imagine the scene. In a desolate place, far from the city and from the usual daily activities of the people, lived a man completely overtaken by suffering. This man, known as the Gadarene Demoniac, was feared by everyone. His presence in the hills and among the tombs frightened even the bravest souls. He was a man tormented, dominated by a force that no one could understand, a legion of demons that had stripped away his peace and dignity entirely. The people of Gadara knew his story well. He wasn't a stranger but someone who had lost everything: his sanity, his connection with family, and the ability to live within society. He wandered through the graveyards, where the dead rested, but for him, there was no rest. His terrifying, pain-filled screams could be heard at night echoing through the valley. It was a sound that made anyone who heard it want to stay as far away from that dark place as possible. This man, possessed by demons, had become so strong that no one could hold him. Many times, people had tried to restrain him with iron chains to prevent him from hurting himself or others. But every time, he would break the chains apart, snapping the metal like it was mere string. His strength was beyond human capacity, it was unnatural, fueled by the dark forces that controlled him. People would watch him from afar, horrified as he would tear through the metal restraints, often injuring himself in the process. His body was covered in scars, wounds both old and fresh, as he would often take sharp stones and cut himself in fits of anguish and despair. His appearance was alarming. His hair was matted and tangled, his skin filthy, marked with dirt and blood from the cuts he inflicted upon himself. His clothes were nothing more than torn rags barely clinging to his body. He looked like a man who had been abandoned by hope itself, lost to the torment that held him captive. Day and night, he roamed through the tombs and the hills, isolated from any human connection, lost in a constant cycle of pain and destruction. It was as if he was trapped in a nightmare, reliving torment over and over again without relief. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of his condition was his eyes. Those who dared to come close enough to see him said his eyes reflected the torment inside him. They were filled with a mixture of rage, despair, and an intense sadness. It was clear that this man was suffering deeply, and he was powerless to stop it. The demons inside him controlled his every move, leaving him in a state of torment that no one could understand, let alone cure. To the people of Gadara, he was a hopeless case, someone beyond saving, a reminder of the darkness and evil in the world. Families warned their children to stay far from the tombs and hills, whispering stories about the man who lived among the dead. He had become a symbol of fear and despair, a tragic figure whose humanity had been consumed by the darkness that overtook him. There was no one who dared to help him, no one who believed he could ever be free from the terrible forces that had claimed him. But what no one realized was that something extraordinary was about to happen. For years, this man had lived in agony, isolated and feared, with no escape from his suffering. But on this day, the Son of God had stepped onto the shores of Gadara, bringing with him a light that would pierce through even the deepest darkness. And though this tormented man had lived as a captive to the forces of evil for so long, he was about to encounter a power greater than any he had ever known, a power that could set him free. The Gadarene demoniac was feared by everyone who knew his story, and one reason was his terrifying, superhuman strength. People had tried to restrain him countless times. They knew he was dangerous, not because of who he once was but because of what he had become. This man, once a part of their community, had been overtaken by dark, unseen forces that changed him completely. He was controlled by demons, and these evil spirits gave him a strength unlike anything anyone had ever witnessed. The villagers had tried everything they could think of to contain him. They would gather chains made of the thickest, strongest metal they had, and several strong men would work together to tie him down. They would wrap his wrists and ankles with chains, thinking that this time, he would finally be held. They believed that maybe if he was bound, he wouldn't be able to harm himself or anyone else. But every attempt failed. His strength was beyond human ability, as if the very forces of darkness fueled his power. Every time they thought they had him restrained, the man would let out a horrifying scream, a sound that seemed to come from deep within him, mixed with anger and unbearable pain. With a surge of strength, he would break the chains apart as if they were nothing more than thread. The iron links would snap, flying in all directions, leaving him free to wander again among the tombs and hills. No one could understand how he managed to do it, but it was clear that no chain, no matter how strong, could hold him. Witnesses to these scenes would tell of the fear they felt, watching him break free, his face contorted in torment and rage. There was nothing natural about it, he was controlled by something far beyond human comprehension. Parents would gather their children and hurry away, and no one dared to approach him. He lived entirely alone, surrounded by the graves and rocky hills, in a place no one else wanted to go. He had become isolated from society, lost in a state of complete despair, but still a constant source of fear for those who lived nearby. In his moments of rage and suffering, the man would often grab sharp stones and cut himself, as though trying to escape his own torment. His body was covered in scars, his skin torn and bloody, showing the evidence of his pain and self-destruction. He was like a person trapped in a prison that no one could see, desperate and without any control over his actions. The demonic forces inside him tormented him relentlessly, giving him only pain and suffering in return for the terrifying strength they provided. Because of his terrifying strength and unpredictable behavior, he was left completely alone. People feared him so much that they stopped trying to help him or reach him. No one visited the hills where he lived, and no one wanted to remember what had happened to him. It was as if he had become a living ghost, a man who was still alive but was cut off from everything good and normal in life. He was, in every way, a prisoner of darkness, living a life that no one else could even imagine. But his story was not over. This man, trapped in darkness, with a strength that no chain could hold, was about to meet someone who would not turn away, someone who was not afraid. Jesus had arrived in Gadara, and the power that flowed through Jesus was greater than any force that had ever bound this man. The demons might have given him strength, but he was about to encounter a greater power, one that could not only break physical chains but could set his very soul free. For the first time in years, this man's life was about to change, not by the strength that terrified others, but by the compassion and authority of the Son of God. As Jesus stepped onto the shores of Gadara, his presence seemed to radiate an invisible light that reached far and wide, piercing the darkness that had long oppressed this land. The air was thick with an uneasy tension, as if every creature in the area could sense that something powerful, something holy, had arrived. Far in the distance, among the hills and tombs where the possessed man wandered, there was an instant reaction. Although he hadn't seen Jesus with his own eyes yet, the man felt the impact of Jesus' presence like a powerful wave. The demons within him stirred restlessly, recognizing that someone far greater, someone with authority over them, had stepped into their territory. Their grip on the man's tortured soul tightened as they sensed what was coming, knowing that their power was now threatened. Without fully understanding why, the man, under the control of the legion of demons, began to move toward Jesus. It was as though he was being drawn, pulled by an invisible force he could not resist. His body, bruised and battered from years of torment, moved rapidly across the rough terrain, his feet carrying him closer and closer to the one person who could bring an end to his suffering. The disciples, watching this scene unfold from a distance, felt a mix of fear and awe. They knew this man's reputation, they had heard of his terrifying strength and his disturbing behavior, and now he was coming directly toward their teacher. As the man approached, he let out a wild, anguished scream, a sound that seemed to come not just from his mouth but from the very depths of his being. The demons, aware of Jesus' authority, cried out through him, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" The man's voice, distorted by the legion of spirits within him, was filled with both terror and defiance. It was a chilling question, revealing that the demons knew exactly who they were facing. They recognized Jesus not just as an ordinary man, but as the Son of God, someone with the power to banish them with a word. There was an incredible tension in that moment, a silent battle of wills. On one side, Jesus stood calm, his gaze fixed on the man, filled with compassion and authority. On the other, the man, trembling and torn, stood before Jesus, his body barely able to contain the conflict raging within. The disciples held their breath, feeling the weight of the spiritual confrontation. They could sense that this was no ordinary encounter, it was a clash between light and darkness, freedom and captivity, life and death. The demons, sensing their impending defeat, begged, "Don't torment us." It was as if they knew their time in this man was coming to an end, that the Son of God had come to set this man free from their control. The very presence of Jesus was too much for them to bear, his holiness and purity exposed their evil and darkness, rendering them powerless before him. For the first time in years, the man's humanity began to surface. Somewhere deep within his soul, buried beneath layers of suffering and demonic control, a glimmer of hope emerged. He could feel the power in Jesus' gaze, a power unlike anything he had ever known. There was no anger, no judgment, only a profound compassion that reached through the darkness and spoke to his lost, broken spirit. And there, on the shores of Gadara, the scene was set for one of the most powerful moments of liberation. The man's suffering was about to end, not by any human intervention but by the direct action of the Son of God. He would be freed from the torment that had plagued him for so long, and the power of Jesus over the forces of evil would be displayed in a way that no one present would ever forget. In that instant, the confrontation reached its peak, with the demoniac, the demons, and Jesus all poised in a tension that would soon break, leading to a miraculous transformation. As the confrontation unfolded on the shores of Gadara, Jesus looked directly at the tormented man before him. Though the man's face was twisted in anguish and his body was tense with rage and suffering, Jesus saw beyond the outward signs of torment. He saw a soul trapped in darkness, desperate for freedom. Jesus, with authority and compassion, spoke to the spirits within the man, demanding to know their name. His voice was calm yet commanding, reaching deep into the man's troubled spirit, leaving no room for the demons to hide. In response, the man's mouth opened, but it was not truly him who spoke. The dark spirits within him forced his voice to speak their dreadful secret. "My name is Legion," the voice said, resonating with a chilling mix of defiance and fear. "For we are many." The word legion was a term that struck fear into the hearts of everyone who heard it. In the Roman Empire, a legion was a unit of thousands of soldiers, disciplined, organized, and powerful. By choosing this name, the demons were revealing that their hold on this man was not just the work of a single evil spirit. There were countless demons inside him, working together, possessing him entirely, and resisting any attempt to release him from their control. This revelation made the scene even more intense. Those witnessing this encounter were shocked to realize the extent of this man's suffering. A single evil spirit was terrifying enough, but here was a man possessed by a legion, thousands of dark, malicious forces at work within him, each one contributing to his agony, each one strengthening the hold of darkness on his life. It was as if he had been invaded and occupied by an entire army of evil spirits, all working together to strip away every ounce of his humanity. The name Legion captured the horrifying depth of his suffering. These demons had robbed him of everything: his peace, his sanity, his connection to his family and friends. They had taken over his mind and body, turning him into a prisoner within his own skin. And each demon added its own layer of torment, amplifying his pain, creating a cycle of despair that seemed inescapable. Together, they formed a powerful, united force that would resist any attempt to drive them out. But despite their strength in numbers, the legion was terrified of Jesus. They knew that the authority and holiness of the Son of God could overpower even the greatest force of evil. The spirits within the man quivered with fear, their once unbreakable hold now beginning to slip in the presence of Jesus. They recognized that his power far exceeded theirs and that their time in this man was coming to an end. The weight of the situation became even more evident. The presence of Legion revealed just how dire this man's situation had been. He had lived with this torment for years, suffering under a force that no one could imagine or understand. The people who had tried to help him had given up, thinking he was beyond saving. But now, standing before him was the one person who could set him free, the one person with authority over the entire spiritual realm. This moment was more than just a confrontation, it was a display of the power struggle between good and evil. The demons had invaded this man's life, filling him with fear, anger, and despair. They had organized themselves, like an army, to keep him in chains. But now, faced with the authority of Jesus, their power was crumbling. With the name Legion, the spirits tried to intimidate, to make themselves seem invincible. But Jesus was unmoved. His compassion for the suffering man remained steady, and his determination to set him free was unwavering. The sheer number of demons inside the man did not scare Jesus, instead, it highlighted the greatness of the miracle that was about to take place. No matter how many demons held this man captive, Jesus' power was greater. In that tense moment, it became clear that the end of the Legion's reign was near. The spirits that had terrorized this man for so long were about to be cast out, and the man who had been trapped in darkness was about to experience freedom like never before. The demons within the man knew that their time was running out. Faced with the authority of Jesus, they could feel their power slipping away. They understood that Jesus held the authority to cast them out and send them to a place they deeply feared, the abyss, a place of total confinement and punishment reserved for fallen spirits. They knew the terror of such a fate, a place where their evil would be contained, isolated, and removed from any ability to cause harm. Desperate to avoid this punishment, the demons began to beg. They pleaded with Jesus, not with confidence, but with a trembling fear that revealed just how vulnerable they were in his presence. Though they had boasted of being a legion, their power was nothing before the Son of God. They had come face to face with a power they could not overcome, and now, all they could do was beg for mercy. In their desperation, the demons asked Jesus for an alternative. They saw a large herd of pigs grazing nearby on the hillside and, recognizing their inevitable defeat, they made a strange and desperate request. "Send us into the pigs," they begged, "so that we may enter them." They hoped that, by possessing the animals, they could avoid the terrifying fate of being cast into the abyss. Even in their twisted reasoning, they saw this as a better option than facing total confinement and punishment. This request revealed much about the demons' nature. They would rather occupy any living creature, even animals, than face the consequences of their actions. They clung to whatever small chance they had to avoid the judgment Jesus could impose. The scene was surreal, with these dark, malicious spirits openly begging for an escape. Their defiance turned to pleading in the face of Jesus' authority. They knew that, unlike any human they had tormented, Jesus held complete control over their destiny. The disciples and onlookers watched in awe and fear, realizing that this confrontation had revealed the true power and holiness of Jesus. The legion that had terrorized a man and caused fear throughout Gadara was now reduced to begging for mercy before the Son of God. Seeing the desperation of the demons and understanding their plea, Jesus, in his wisdom and authority, granted them permission to enter the nearby herd of pigs. It was a surprising moment for everyone watching. They had just seen a terrifying legion of demons, who had tortured a man for years, begging to be cast into animals rather than face the ultimate judgment. And now, with a word, Jesus released them into the herd. The transfer happened in an instant. The entire herd of pigs, numbering about 2,000, suddenly began to thrash and scream as the demons entered them. The animals, now possessed by these dark spirits, went wild. They stampeded in a frenzy, moving in unison as if driven by an uncontrollable force. Their behavior became chaotic and frenzied, eyes wide and panicked, squealing and crashing against one another in utter terror. The people who had been watching from a distance were stunned. The normally docile pigs turned into a stampeding mass of chaos, heading straight for the edge of a steep hill. Without hesitation, the entire herd charged forward and, one by one, plunged off the cliffside and into the sea below. The waters foamed and splashed as each pig hit the water, ultimately drowning, their bodies floating in the sea as a haunting reminder of the dark spirits that had controlled them. This shocking event was not only a display of Jesus' power over the forces of darkness but also a visible sign of the destructive nature of these demons. What they had done to this herd of animals was a glimpse of the torment they had inflicted upon the man for so long. The villagers who witnessed this were left speechless, realizing the incredible authority Jesus wielded and the depth of the suffering this man had endured under such evil forces. But above all, this dramatic display showed that the man who had been tormented was now truly free. The evil that had plagued him was gone, cast into the sea along with the pigs, never to torment him again. As soon as Jesus granted permission for the demons to leave the man and enter the herd of pigs, a shocking and unforgettable scene unfolded. The demons, now inhabiting the bodies of the animals, drove the pigs into a frenzied state. It was as though an invisible storm had swept through them, filling each pig with terror and chaos. The animals, once calm and peacefully grazing on the hillside, were now overtaken by a wild, uncontrollable force. The herd, numbering about 2,000, began to stampede together, squealing and shrieking as they ran. Their eyes were wide with fear, their bodies thrashing and pressing against each other in a panicked, chaotic rush. The people watching from a distance looked on in horror and amazement as the entire herd raced toward the edge of a steep cliff that overlooked the sea. In unison, as if drawn by an unseen hand, the pigs charged over the cliff, plunging into the water below. The sight was intense, with waves splashing and the sea churning as each animal hit the water. The sound of their cries faded as they sank, leaving only silence and the rolling waves behind. It was a dramatic and unsettling end for the animals, and yet, in this destruction, there was a profound symbol at work. The drowning of the pigs served as a visible sign of the power and authority of Jesus. These demons, who had tormented the man so viciously, were cast out in a single command. The dark, destructive force that had bound him for so long was now gone, defeated, and cast into the depths of the sea. The chaos and devastation inflicted upon the pigs highlighted the true nature of the demonic oppression, a force that brings only destruction and suffering. And now, through Jesus' authority, that force was removed from the man's life entirely. Those who witnessed this were filled with awe and fear, realizing they had just seen a display of divine power. The man who had been tortured for years was now finally free, and the force that once controlled him was gone, submerged in the depths of the sea. The dramatic end of the pigs underscored the depth of Jesus' authority and the freedom he brought to those oppressed by darkness. As the chaos subsided and the last of the pigs disappeared beneath the water, an incredible calm settled over the scene. For the first time in what must have felt like an eternity, the once tormented man stood still. The silence around him was profound, a stark contrast to the years of torment he had endured. He no longer felt the weight of the dark forces that had controlled him for so long. The agony, fear, and uncontrollable rage had vanished, leaving behind a sense of peace he had never known. Those watching could hardly believe their eyes. The man, who had once roamed the hills screaming in anguish, breaking chains, and cutting himself with stones, was now completely calm. His face, which had been a mask of pain and fury, was transformed. His eyes, which had once reflected torment and despair, now showed peace and gratitude. For the first time, he felt free from the agony that had gripped his soul, free from the countless demons that had kept him prisoner, and free from the darkness that had isolated him from the world. This moment was nothing short of miraculous. As he looked at Jesus, the man's expression was one of deep awe and thankfulness. He knew that it was the presence of Jesus that had set him free. This was no ordinary man. Jesus held a power unlike anything he had ever encountered, a power stronger than the legion of demons that had enslaved him. And yet, Jesus had used that power with compassion, bringing him not only deliverance but also a new beginning. The disciples and villagers watched in amazement, recognizing the transformation that had taken place. They had known this man as the terror of the region, a figure to be feared and avoided. But now he stood before them, completely changed, no longer a threat, but a testament to the liberating power of Jesus. He was no longer a symbol of fear but a symbol of hope, a living example of what could happen when light overcame darkness. The man's mind and spirit, once fragmented and shattered, now felt whole and complete. He could finally see the world clearly, free from the fog of oppression that had clouded his thoughts for so long. He felt like a new person, as if he had been reborn. In this moment, he experienced true freedom, not just freedom from physical chains, but a deep spiritual freedom that came from the healing power of Jesus. For the man, this was the culmination of years of suffering. The nightmares were over, and he could now look forward to a future unshackled by darkness. This was more than just a physical or mental transformation, it was a profound spiritual rebirth. In Jesus, he had found not only a deliverer but also a savior, someone who cared enough to cross the sea, confront evil, and restore his life. This was a moment of victory, not only for the man but for everyone who witnessed it. The oppressive power of darkness had been defeated, and the peace and freedom of God had triumphed. As news of the miraculous deliverance spread, the people of Gadara began to gather near the shore where Jesus stood with his disciples and the man who had been freed. The townspeople had always known the tormented man as a figure to be feared. Parents had warned their children to avoid the hills and tombs where he roamed, and travelers passing by Gadara had heard of his wild strength and terrifying screams echoing in the night. Now, hearing that this same man was somehow calm and transformed, they could hardly believe it. Curiosity, mixed with fear, drove them to see for themselves. As they approached, they saw the man sitting peacefully at Jesus' feet. His eyes, once filled with terror and rage, now shone with clarity and calm. He was dressed in clean clothes, his scars visible but no longer raw and bleeding, and his face bore a peaceful expression. This was a man they had never truly seen before. The same individual who had once terrorized the region was now a picture of peace and restoration. The sight was both awe-inspiring and unnerving. Some whispered to each other, glancing at Jesus with a mixture of amazement and fear. Who was this man who held such power over the unseen forces that had once controlled their former neighbor? They recognized that this was no ordinary miracle. To see a man freed from such a terrible, supernatural oppression left them filled with a deep sense of wonder. They couldn't deny that something extraordinary had happened right before their eyes. Yet, their amazement was tempered by fear. They saw the herd of pigs that had plunged into the sea, and they knew it was the demons within those pigs that had driven them to their destruction. The loss of such a large herd represented an economic blow for the town, and their awe at Jesus' power was quickly shadowed by concern over what other disruptions his presence might bring. They wondered if his power, which had cast out a legion, could also disrupt other parts of their lives. As they looked between Jesus, the man who had been freed, and the quiet sea where the herd of pigs had disappeared, fear began to take hold of some hearts. Despite witnessing the miracle, many were hesitant to accept Jesus. His power was undeniable, but it was also unsettling, challenging their understanding of the world. The unknown nature of Jesus' authority made them uneasy, and instead of embracing this incredible act of deliverance, they began to question what it might mean for their town. Some spoke out, asking Jesus to leave. They respected the power they had seen, but they didn't know how to welcome it into their lives. The miracle had confronted them with a divine presence that both intrigued and frightened them. Though they saw a man's life restored, their fear of the unknown outweighed their willingness to embrace Jesus and what he offered. In this mixed reaction of wonder and fear, the crowd's response reflected the reality of human nature. When faced with something truly divine, people often struggle to balance awe with fear, to choose between welcoming transformation or holding on to familiar routines. In their astonishment and anxiety, they chose the latter, missing the deeper gift Jesus offered. As the people gathered around, still in shock from the events they had just witnessed, an uneasy tension filled the air. They had seen something beyond their understanding, a man who once terrorized their region, freed from the dark forces that had controlled him. They had heard the terrifying cries of the demon-possessed pigs as they ran into the sea and disappeared beneath the waves. This series of powerful, supernatural events left them feeling both amazed and deeply unsettled. The man who had been freed now stood calmly by Jesus, a living testament to the power of the one who had set him free. But as much as this miraculous transformation brought a sense of awe, it also brought fear. The townspeople looked to Jesus, seeing him not as a healer or savior but as an unknown force they couldn't understand or control. His presence, though peaceful, seemed to disrupt their world, stirring up forces they would rather not confront. With every glance at the freed man and the empty sea where the pigs had perished, the crowd felt an increasing sense of unease. The miracle that had happened was undeniable, yet the implications of it weighed heavily on their minds. They were used to living in a world where spiritual forces remained hidden, where dark powers were acknowledged but avoided, not challenged. Jesus had not only revealed these forces but had shown he held authority over them, and that power made the people uncomfortable. Whispers grew among the crowd, voices tinged with fear and suspicion. Some murmured about the loss of the pigs, their livelihoods disrupted by this unexpected event. Others worried about what might happen if Jesus stayed. Would there be more confrontations, more disturbances? Instead of seeing the possibility of hope and restoration, they focused on the disruption his presence had already caused. Finally, a few brave voices spoke up, voicing the fear that had taken hold of many hearts. "Please, leave our territory," they asked, their tone respectful yet firm. They were not hostile, but it was clear they wanted Jesus to go. They feared what else might happen if he remained, how else their lives might change. They didn't understand the fullness of who Jesus was or what he offered, and the unknown frightened them more than the miracle inspired them. Jesus, seeing the fear in their eyes and the hesitation in their hearts, understood their request. He didn't argue or try to convince them to let him stay. With compassion and respect, he honored their choice, knowing that they weren't ready to embrace the deeper transformation he offered. This decision would mean missing out on the peace and freedom he could bring, but Jesus didn't force himself upon them. Instead, he quietly prepared to leave, respecting the townspeople's wishes while still offering a final act of mercy to the man he had just freed. The townspeople had seen a miracle, but fear and a desire for normalcy led them to turn away from the very source of hope standing before them. Jesus' departure would leave them with questions and perhaps a lingering sense of wonder, but ultimately, they had chosen to stay in the familiar, even if it meant missing the freedom he could bring. This moment, filled with both wonder and sorrow, highlighted the profound choice that each person faces when encountering the divine: to accept the unknown with faith or to remain in the comfort of what is familiar, even if it leaves the soul unchanged. As Jesus prepared to leave, the man who had been freed from the demons came to him, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude, awe, and longing. For years, he had been bound in darkness, separated from his family, friends, and community. His life had been one of unimaginable torment, isolated among the tombs, cut off from the love and companionship that every human soul craves. Now, for the first time, he was free. His mind was clear, his spirit was at peace, and he felt a deep sense of joy and gratitude that he could hardly put into words. The man looked at Jesus, the one who had changed his life so completely, and felt an overwhelming desire to stay close to him. He knew that this man held the power of God, that he had brought him back from a living death. In Jesus, he had found not only a deliverer but a friend, someone who saw him, even in his brokenness, and cared enough to save him. He couldn't imagine going back to his old life, to the town that had shunned him, or to the people who only knew him as the man possessed by demons. He wanted to leave all that behind and start fresh, following Jesus wherever he went. With a heart full of devotion and gratitude, the man approached Jesus and made his request. "Let me go with you," he said earnestly, his voice trembling with emotion. He was willing to leave everything, his past, his hometown, and whatever future might await him there, to be with the one who had restored his life. He wanted to be close to Jesus, to learn from him, to walk beside him, and to share in the work that had saved him. For him, this was not just a request, it was the natural response of a heart overflowing with love and gratitude. The disciples and onlookers watched this interaction, sensing the depth of the man's devotion. They understood that his request was genuine, coming from a place of profound transformation. This was more than a simple desire to follow a teacher, it was the response of a man who had been given a second chance at life, and he wanted nothing more than to stay near the one who had made that possible. Though Jesus knew the man's heart and the sincerity of his desire, he had a different plan for him. With kindness and compassion, Jesus gently told him, "Return to your own home, and declare what great things God has done for you." Jesus understood that the man's story of deliverance could inspire his family, his community, and even those who had once feared and shunned him. His testimony could bring hope to others, showing them the power of God's love and the possibility of redemption. Though it may not have been the answer he expected, the man accepted Jesus' words. He knew that Jesus was sending him on a mission, to be a living example of God's mercy and power to those who knew his past. And so, with a heart still full of devotion and gratitude, he turned back to Gadara, ready to share his story and the miracle of his freedom with all who would listen. As the man stood before Jesus, his heart full of devotion and gratitude, he listened as Jesus gently gave him a new purpose. Rather than letting him join the group and follow him from town to town, Jesus looked into the man's eyes and spoke with a clear, compassionate authority, "Return to your own home, and declare what great things God has done for you." This was not just a suggestion, it was a calling, a mission given directly by the one who had freed him. In that moment, the man understood that Jesus was entrusting him with something powerful and important. He realized that his story of deliverance, his journey from torment to freedom, was meant to be shared. He was no longer simply a man who had been possessed by demons, he was now a witness to God's mercy and power. Jesus had given him the gift of a new life, and now he was asking him to share that gift with others. The man's mind raced as he imagined returning to his home and facing the people who had known him only as a figure of fear. He knew there would be questions and doubt, but he also understood the impact his story could have. By sharing what God had done for him, he could show others that no darkness was too great for God's light to penetrate. He could bring hope to those who felt trapped or lost, revealing that freedom and healing were possible through the power of God. Jesus' instructions weren't easy. It would have been simpler, perhaps, to follow him, to stay close to the one who had saved him and continue living in the safety of his presence. But Jesus knew that this man's greatest purpose now lay in going back, returning as a living testimony to God's work. His life had become a message, one that would speak louder than any words alone could ever do. The man accepted this mission with a sense of honor and humility. He understood that Jesus saw him not only as someone who had been saved but also as someone with a purpose. He was to be a witness, a messenger to his own people. Through his story, the people of Gadara could see the compassion, authority, and power of Jesus, the one who had driven out a legion of demons and restored a lost soul. With a final look of gratitude and reverence, the man prepared to leave. Though he was returning to familiar places, he knew he was going back as a new person, someone with a profound and sacred calling. His heart was full of hope and strength, ready to share the incredible story of what God had done in his life. And so, with courage and faith, he set out on his new mission, carrying the light of his testimony to those who needed it most. With his heart full of purpose and his spirit renewed, the man who had once been tormented by demons began his journey back to his homeland. Each step he took was filled with a sense of freedom he had never known, a lightness in his soul as he returned not as the feared, broken figure he had once been, but as a man transformed. Jesus had given him a mission, a calling, and he was determined to fulfill it. As he neared the familiar streets of his town, people began to recognize him. At first, they looked on in disbelief, some even stepping back in fear. This was the man who had once roamed among the tombs, who screamed in the night, broke chains with his bare hands, and terrified anyone who crossed his path. But now, he was calm, his face clear and peaceful, a far cry from the wild-eyed, tormented soul they remembered. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people whispered to each other, astonished by his transformation. The man took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. He began to speak, his voice steady and filled with conviction. He shared his story openly, describing the years of darkness and torment he had endured, the overwhelming control of the demons, and the hopelessness that had consumed him. But then, he told them of Jesus, the man who had crossed the sea, who had faced the demons without fear, and who had freed him with a single command. He spoke of the compassion and authority of Jesus, of how this encounter had changed him forever. People listened intently, drawn in by the sincerity and depth of his words. They saw not only the change in his outward appearance but also the light in his eyes, a reflection of the freedom and peace he now carried within him. His story was powerful, touching the hearts of those who heard it, for they could see that his transformation was real. Through his testimony, they came to understand that this was no ordinary healing, it was a divine act of love and mercy. As he shared his testimony, new opportunities began to open before him. People who had once shunned him now wanted to hear more. Some asked him to visit their families, to share his story of deliverance with loved ones who were struggling, in need of hope and healing. Others began to ask questions about Jesus, wanting to know more about the one who had the power to overcome even the darkest forces. The man embraced these opportunities, traveling from village to village, sharing the miracle of his liberation with anyone willing to listen. His life had become a testament to the power of God's love, and through his story, he planted seeds of faith and hope in the hearts of many. The same man who had once been a symbol of fear and despair was now a beacon of hope and inspiration, a living witness to the power of Jesus' compassion and authority. In his homeland and beyond, he shared his story again and again, fulfilling the mission Jesus had given him. And with each telling, he reminded people that no darkness is too great for God's light to overcome, that there is always hope for those who seek it. Through his testimony, he became a part of something greater, spreading the message of freedom and healing to those who needed it most. The impact of the man's testimony was immediate and profound. As he traveled through his homeland, sharing his story of deliverance and transformation, the people who once feared him began to see him in a new light. They listened to him with open hearts, captivated by the authenticity of his words and the undeniable change they saw before their eyes. This man, once shunned and feared, was now a messenger of hope, carrying a message that stirred the hearts of everyone who heard it. People began to speak in hushed voices, filled with wonder and curiosity. Could this really be the same man who lived among the tombs? They asked each other. What kind of power could change a life so completely? As they pondered these questions, they found themselves drawn to the source of his transformation, Jesus. They wanted to know more about this man who had not only crossed the sea but had faced the dark forces within their midst and restored one of their own. His testimony stirred something deep within them. It was as if, through his words, they could feel a glimpse of the power and love of Jesus themselves. Some who had struggled with their own fears and challenges found hope in his story, believing that if God could transform this man, then surely there was hope for them too. The man's transformation was so complete, so genuine, that it inspired faith in others, leading them to wonder what else was possible with Jesus. Families gathered to hear his story, friends brought friends, and soon the news spread to nearby towns and villages. Even those who hadn't witnessed his former state could sense the power of his testimony. He spoke not as a religious teacher or a preacher, but as a man who had experienced God's mercy firsthand. His humility and gratitude were evident, and this sincerity made his message even more compelling. People who had never met Jesus in person felt as if they were meeting him through this man's words. They began to question the beliefs they had held, to seek out the truth about this Jesus who had authority over demons and compassion for the brokenhearted. Conversations about Jesus filled homes, markets, and gathering places as people wrestled with the profound reality that God's power was truly at work among them. In the end, the man's testimony had an effect far beyond what he could have imagined. He became a living example of God's grace, showing that even the darkest moments could be transformed by faith. His story inspired admiration, curiosity, and a deep longing for a greater understanding of the one who had saved him. Through his life, people began to see that Jesus was more than just a healer. He was the source of a power that could change hearts, free captives, and bring new life. And so, the man's story lived on, impacting countless others, drawing them closer to the truth, and sparking a faith that would continue to grow. As we reach the conclusion of this story, let's take a moment to reflect on what it reveals about spiritual liberation, the power of Jesus over the forces of darkness, and the impact of a personal testimony. This is a story of transformation on every level, one that began with fear and despair but ends with freedom and hope. In it, we see the profound truth that no darkness is too great for Jesus to overcome. The man who had been bound and tormented for years experienced firsthand the liberating power of Christ. His story is not just about the expulsion of demons but about the restoration of a broken soul. Jesus didn't just set him free from physical torment, he gave him a new life, one filled with purpose, peace, and wholeness. This man's journey is a vivid illustration of what spiritual liberation truly means. It's the breaking of chains, the release from the oppression that once defined him, and the beginning of a life marked by peace and purpose. This encounter also highlights Jesus' authority over the forces of evil. When Jesus arrived in Gadara, the demons recognized his power immediately. They knew they were no match for him. This story reminds us that the power of Jesus extends beyond our understanding, reaching into the deepest realms of spiritual bondage. He is not only a teacher or healer but the Son of God, with authority over all things. His power is absolute, his compassion limitless, and his willingness to face evil on our behalf is profound. Jesus' victory over these dark forces brings hope to all who feel trapped, whether by fear, pain, or circumstances beyond their control. Finally, this story demonstrates the incredible value of personal testimony. The man's transformation served as a beacon of hope and a powerful testament to the love and mercy of God. By sharing his story, he became a living witness, showing others that freedom is possible, that no one is beyond redemption. His life showed that faith in Jesus has the power to change everything. Through his testimony, others were inspired to seek Jesus, to question their beliefs, and to open their hearts to God's power. In this story, we are reminded that each of us carries the potential to share a message of hope. Our experiences, our transformations, and our faith can impact the lives of others, sparking curiosity, stirring faith, and drawing people closer to the truth. The Gadarene man's story is one of redemption, not only for himself but for everyone who witnessed or heard it. In the end, this account of the Gadarene demoniac is more than a story about a single man's liberation, it's a profound message for us all. It speaks to the power of Jesus to free us from whatever holds us captive, to bring peace where there was once torment, and to use our lives as a testimony to God's grace and love. And as we carry these lessons forward, we can remember that we, too, have the opportunity to live as witnesses to the transforming power of Jesus, sharing our stories and spreading light wherever there is darkness.